Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome, and today we're speaking with Afshan Astavar, who's an assistant professor at the Naval Postgraduate School and is also affiliated with the Middle East program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He is also the author of Vanguard of the Imam and 2 recent journal articles about Iranian proxies that have come out in Security Studies and International Affairs. For links to both of those, you can look down in the show notes. Afshan, it's good to have you on the show, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, I think for listeners, I mean, obviously it's clear in your titles what it is that we're going to talk about. There's been a lot of activity in the Persian Gulf, tit for tat between the Iranian government and the U.S. government. Clearly, things are more tense than I can remember them being in recent years. What's going on?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think part of the problem is nobody knows what's going on completely. You've had a strange buildup over the last week, which began with with the United States voicing some concerns about recent intelligence that they had sort of collected regarding Iran sort of preparing for potential possible attacks against everything from U.S. personnel in Iraq, in the Baghdad embassy or the consulate in Erbil, or even against maritime vessels and traffic in the Persian Gulf, the loading of missiles onto small Iranian merchant boats called dhows. And all of it sort of changed a shift in U.S. rhetoric. You had sort of the USS Lincoln Carrier Strike Group sort of make a beeline for the Persian Gulf. You had some other actions taken in Iraq, etc. And then in the midst of that, you had a mysterious attack in the port of Fujairah in the UAE, where 4 vessels, 2 Saudi, 1 Emirati, and 1 Norwegian flagged vessel were attacked in the middle of the night by some seemingly small explosive devices, which did minimal damage, but seemed to sort of fit everything that the U.S. had been warning about, that maritime vessels could be struck by Iran. So, what has been real puzzling, I think, for everybody who watches this stuff is what has happened afterwards, after that attack. If you were sort of took the U.S. at their word, or took the National Security Advisor Bolton at his word, any attack was going to be met with sort of overwhelming force. But what has been interesting is they have been sort of very hesitant to attribute any direct blame to anybody regarding this attack. There's been some anonymous quotes from anonymous officials that have indicated that Iran might be behind it, but nobody's really coming out and saying who's behind the attack. So in the context, this is either sort of we're on the verge of war, or we're on the verge of just a very sort of awkward dance, and it's not clear what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to those 4 attacks, which maybe we should dive into, there was also the Houthis, which do have a relationship with Iran, use some sort of unmanned vehicle, a drone, to fly into a pipeline that the Saudis had built up to avoid the Strait of Hormuz. And if you put 2 and 2 together, again, everything is murky. It certainly seems like groups or Iranian affiliated groups were sending a message that they could severely hamper commerce or the flow of energy through the strait.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly the takeaway. Fujairah is also an access point that avoids the Strait of Hormuz, and so those are the 2 ways to sort of get oil out of the Gulf without going through the strait. So, if you were to sort of look at this, without in a different context, you would have no problem, I think, sort of thinking of these attacks as coordinated, as connected, as sending a very clear message about a certain actor's ability to complicate or interfere with the exporting of oil and the larger sort of oil and gas industry in the Persian Gulf through these types of sabotage or attacks. The Houthi attack on the pipeline was directly attributed to the Houthis. The Houthis, I believe, took credit for it. There was nothing ambiguous about that, and in that sense, it very much fits sort of a pattern of how the Houthis operate, and for them striking sort of targets within Saudi Arabia and oil targets in particular is nothing new. They've done that in the past. So in some sense, that fits the track record of the Houthis. But yeah, I think if you put it together, the implication is certainly, I think, clear. And this is what makes, from my perspective at least, the relative silence regarding the attacks in Fujairah sort of confusing.
Explain that a bit. So it certainly seems like this is, again, we don't want to speculate, but it certainly seems like if you wanted to create ambiguity about attribution, the Fujairah attacks are like a very good way to do that, or at least a picture perfect example about how to muddy the waters.
Oh yeah, certainly. I think from the attacker's perspective, it did whatever they wanted it to do. I'm speaking more about sort of from those who were attacked, right? Because the Emiratis, the Saudis, and in this case, the Americans have all been sort of, quite strong in their language regarding Iran. And if you believe sort of the rhetoric that coming from, Washington or in other places, you would suspect that this is what they were waiting for, right? That they were waiting for an attack such as this for them to respond against Iran. Again, assuming that they assumed that Iran was behind these attacks. But they're not doing that, right? They're not reacting in the way that they have said that they would react. And so this leads you to sort of, two or three, different possibilities. One, they don't actually know who attacked those vessels in Fujairah and don't actually have any evidence for it. That for me is hard to believe, but it could be possible. Two, they do know who attacked Fujairah, but they are uncertain about what they want to do in response, or are planning a response, and want to make sure that response is fully articulated on their end before they go forward with anything. Or three, they did not anticipate this attack. The attack itself was very limited, and they don't know how to respond to it, and frankly have gotten cold feet about responding with military force and are trying to find some other means to do so. There's other possibilities as well. But I think if you look at the attack in Fujairah, what's interesting about it is how much damage it did not cause, right? I don't believe that it was a failed attack. I think it was very deliberate what happened. And what happened was a very minimal amount of damage, almost a superficial amount of damage on each vessel. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was killed. Nothing was sunk. No oil was spilled. If your message is to say, if the message that you want to say, to send is to say, listen, we can strike whenever we want. You can't stop us from striking. Your oil industry, your economy are all vulnerable to us. And so you should think twice about exerting maximum pressure, on us, because we can act out too. But we're not doing it now. We're just showing you that we have this capability. If that's the message you want to send, I think it came across. But it also makes it hard for, I think, those attacked to really respond in the way that they said they would, right? Because nobody was hurt, nobody was killed, no oil was spilled, nothing was sunk. What is a response? Do you launch missiles? Let's say they believe again that it's Iran, which is, to me, my assumption in all of this, although there's no proof of it yet. And there may not have been Iran. So, this is all speculation. But let's just say they believe that it's Iran. How do you respond? Can they get enough support regionally or even, internationally for a very disproportionate, heavy-handed military response against Iran, in response to an attack that that did such minimal damage, or do you just, launch a rocket, at an Iranian shipyard and call it even? What does that achieve? What does that help your cause? In no way does that sort of dissuade Iran. I think there's real confusion on their part as to what to do and how to proceed. And I think that's what's, in some ways making this moment so opaque, is because there's a real disagreement, I assume, if not, just sort of an absolute uncertainty on what exactly it is they're trying to accomplish now.
I mean, as somebody who studied Iranian proxies and how they operate in the region, and would you say that this is indicative of previous strategy or something new altogether? Again, assuming that your assumption is true.
Yeah, and let me just say, I don't know if Iran is behind this or not. There's no evidence for it, and so I'm not saying that Iran is behind this. I'm just working with the assumption that's already been put out there by unnamed sources that Iran is believed to be behind this. No, if this is not something that any Iranian proxy has achieved or done. Attacking maritime vessels, yes, the Houthis have done it several times. And if you want to go back to, let's say, the Iran-Iraq war during the tanker war period, attacking maritime vessels was a big part of the conflict, and the Iranians did that directly themselves in a number of ways. But this type of attack is very different because it didn't involve, nothing seemingly struck those vessels, right? There was no rocket, there was no RPG, there was no drone. There was no drone boat. Nobody saw anything, right? Which makes you suspect that these were explosives planted on the vessels themselves, which is, a very difficult thing to pull off and takes a lot of training and sophistication that I don't believe the Houthis have. I don't believe other sort of, let's say pro-Iranian clients or proxies have in the Gulf. This is something that I believe only a state could do. And Iran does have this capability. They've had it since the Iran-Iraq war, but they've never used it, to my knowledge, outside of the Iran-Iraq war in this type of fashion. So, yeah, I have a hard time believing that Iranian proxies were behind this, just because I don't believe they had the capabilities to do it.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this is like you have to place it within its broader geopolitical context, which is it was about the 1 year anniversary, I believe, around then. We still are around there when the U.S. withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement, and the reimposition of sanctions, and then obviously the ratcheting up of tensions between the U.S. and Iran. And so it certainly could seem, or at least somebody could make the argument that the Iranians, if they had a hand in this, were reacting to American moves. But I would say that the Americans would say that they were reacting to Iranian moves, hence making the escalatory cycle difficult to pin down.
Right. No, I think that's right. I think what's troubling for many people is that because the U.S. went out and said that they have intelligence that, Iran might attack maritime vessels. And I think within 48 hours, this attack happened. For conspiracists, let's say that's all too convenient, right? For Iran, let's say that intelligence was true. And let's say Iran, really was behind this. That's a pretty bold move, right? That's a bold move if the U.S. comes out and says, we know what you're doing, we know you're planning this, don't do it. And if Iran does it anyway, that's a pretty bold sort of deliberate action. These types of activities take a lot of planning. They're not just sort of hot-headed, rash sort of activities. A lot of work would have gone into this. So it could have been that whoever was behind it, let's say they're on, it's either Iran or Team Iran, that they felt like they needed to pull the trigger and felt like that this type of attack, limited as it was, would still be below the threshold of all-out war, and so would not be escalatory in that regard, but would still send that message. But if you're taking the U.S. at their word, this is precisely the type of incident that would lead to escalation. I've been warning about, this type of moment for a long time, in just about anything that I've written about U.S.-Iranian tensions, or U.S. or Iran, Saudi or Emirati tensions, for a number of years. I felt that we were just sort of one incident like this away from, escalation towards conflict. And so in some ways it's surprising to see a lot of these actors sort of step back and call for sort of cooler heads. The Emiratis, for example, the Emirati foreign minister came out and sort of, called for de-escalation. The Iranians sort of have both sort of, outwardly said they don't want war. The supreme leader said, Iran doesn't want war. But at the same time, they promise, a very tough fight if the U.S. Does want war, right? So they're kind of saying both things. But you're leading to this sort of really nebulous zone, I think, where no side seemingly wants a war, but all sides are sort of doing, I think, a lot of activities and using rhetoric that is making it difficult to avoid conflict.
I mean, I think maybe there's a good point to pivot. Today we were recording this on Thursday, May 16th. It would certainly seem to suggest that President Trump himself is searching for ways to perhaps de-escalate. He's been open with via the media, with his preference for the Iranian supreme leader to give him a call, to use his words, and both the Swiss are coming to town, the Swiss president, as well as a readout from Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, with a telephone call to the Sultan of Oman, who often acts as an intermediary with the Iranians. Do you think that there's a good pathway here to de-escalation? And that the two calmer heads will prevail? Iran will have gotten its licks in, the U.S. will have signaled resolve, and that the two sides can retire to play another day?
I suspect that's where we're headed. But I feel like we're really on the cusp of either that, which to me is less de-escalation, more just sort of status quo, or we're on the cusp of escalation. I'm not sure. I think President Trump has made it clear that he doesn't want war. He wants to talk. He wants to have dialogue. He wants to sit down and talk with these folks. So much as for whatever that means, and what could actually get accomplished in those conversations. I think that's authentically what he actually wants to achieve. And Pompeo, as you said, has met with the Europeans. He's met with the Russians. He's talked with the Sultan of Oman. The Qataris have also reportedly gone out to Iran to help de-escalate things. With the recent Emirati statement from the foreign minister today or yesterday, I think there's far more calls for de-escalation than there are for escalation at this point. And so de-escalation, I think, is the more likely scenario. But I don't think it'll be meaningful de-escalation if it doesn't actually lead to dialogue or low-level talks or talks through intermediaries or something. Because even if we don't go to war at this moment, even if there's not an attack or a response to this attack that's kinetic or military at this moment, we're still in the same sort of heightened security atmosphere, right? Where any misstep could lead to, a decision point that could lead to escalation. So I certainly it feels like we're not headed towards war, but I feel like it's only just that. And really, when it comes to Iran, as much as President Trump wants to talk with Iran, I think Iran is completely unwilling to talk. And frankly, I mean, the Supreme Leader has said that. That's not just my feeling. The Supreme Leader, has directly said that talks are not going to happen. And I think part of the reason is this. One, the Supreme Leader is already predisposed against talks with the United States. Feels that the whole JCPOA effort, the nuclear deal, didn't go, how it was supposed to, and went, frankly, exactly how he thought it would, which is, or at least how he told everybody that he thought it would go, which is that you can't trust the Americans and they'll back out of any deal. So any compromise is really just sort of, futile. But even beyond that, I think, one of the things that's going to make it difficult for Iran to talk at this moment, at least openly, is that it would be seen as capitulation, right? Their arms being twisted, and it would be them saying, "Uncle, we want out of this." From my perspective, I think what Iran wants before it enters into any type of negotiation, whether it be any serious negotiation, whether it be with third parties, and certainly if it were ever to happen directly, is some leverage in the U.S.-Iranian relationship. They have very little leverage, if any, at this moment, right? All of the pressure is being put on Iran. None of the pressure is being put on the United States. I believe all of the intelligence that you've seen with sort of the change in Iran's sort of behavior probably signals their effort to somehow signal to the United States that they're willing to up the ante in order to sort of reset the relationship or to gain leverage in the relationship. If you know anything about Iranians, you know that they want to enter into a negotiation with their heads held high. They want to enter into negotiation feeling pride, feeling dignity. So much as that is meaningful in this context. What I think that actually means is that they feel like they're not just a victim here, right? But they're also sort of they're also a force to be reckoned with. The way that I see this attack in Fujairah, should it have been Iran or connected to Iran, is precisely that, right? Is them trying to sort of remind everybody that they can do things too, that they can exert pressure as well, that it's not a one-way street. And then if you are going to just simply build up pressure against Iran, that it'll respond, it'll react, and that won't be pleasant for anybody. And in doing so, somehow trying to claw back a little hand in this relationship, a little leverage in this relationship, so that when the United States or anybody else meets with Iran, part of the conversation is, we don't want you to do that stuff anymore in reaction to what we're doing. Let's find a way to compromise. So far, what the U.S. has been trying to achieve with Iran is completely maximalist demands, right? The 12 demands that Pompeo had are completely maximalist. It would take absolute outright capitulation for Iran to give in on all of those items. And Iran doesn't want to do that, right? Iran, certainly doesn't want to compromise any more than it already did in the JCPOA. But if it has to compromise with the Trump administration, it wants to do it on its own terms.
Just to pick up on that one point, before we wrap up, the nuclear deal, I always thought was like the easier thing to do because it was essentially Americans trading sanctions relief in exchange for excess monitoring on Iran's nuclear program for 25 years. That's essentially the JCPOA. But with the U.S. signaling, or at least this administration signaling, it doesn't want any part of the JCPOA, or it wants something better than the JCPOA, however defined, what is it that the Iranians would want in return?
That's a good question. Because Iran did not want to negotiate anything outside of the JCPOA, right? I think there was a belief in Washington that the JCPOA was a good thing to achieve because it sort of solved that more pressing question of the nuclear issue. It took the pressure off the United States from having to go to war with Iran if Iran continued to up its enrichment capabilities. But ultimately, it didn't solve all of the issues that the United States had with Iran, right? The real issue that the United States has with Iran is Iran's ongoing conflict with Israel, right? That is the basis of all of U.S.-Iranian tensions from the American side. Iran's support to Hezbollah, Iran's support to Hamas, Iran's activities in Syria connected to all of that. That's the problem that the U.S. has with Iran. But that's also sort of the greatest strategic asset that Iran possesses from its own perspective, right? Is the ability to sort of exert force over Israel. And that's just something that's not going to be compromised on by this supreme leader, at least, right? So what is actually achievable outside of the nuclear domain? I don't know. I mean, what would Iran actually give in to that would be meaningful to the United States? I don't know. I can imagine that the Trump administration would say, okay, a moratorium on testing certain ballistic missiles, right? That's one of those equivocal points in the JCPOA where both sides read it differently. The United States believes that the JCPOA prohibits Iran from sort of testing and developing its ballistic missile program, or any ballistic missile that's sort of nuclear capable. Iran's reading of that is, well, none of our ballistic missiles are nuclear capable, and so all of it is fair game. So I could imagine some compromise on that level. Iran's not going to give up its ballistic missile program. It's not going to stop developing them, but maybe a moratorium, a pause on testing or something like that. But this is all sort of marginal stuff. I don't think the real meaty issues of what the U.S. wants are things that Iran's going to compromise on. And so it's difficult to understand what Iran could actually compromise on that would be acceptable to the United States, and vice versa. And I think this is sort of the challenge with obviously leaving the JCPOA, is this idea that you're going to get a better all-encompassing deal, through, again, sort of reverting to maximum pressure. Hindsight being what it is, I don't know how the Trump administration feels about this, but from my perspective, the JCPOA was the best point of leverage that the United States had with Iran, right? Using the JCPOA as a mechanism to say, hey, we want to stay in this thing. We think this is great, but all of your other behavior is also problematic to us. And so we really need to talk about this stuff. And if we don't find a way to compromise on this stuff, maybe, we're going to have to rethink the JCPOA. That could have happened in the Trump administration, and whether it would have had results or not, I don't know. But I think it would have borne more fruit, or at least, led to more possibilities for diplomacy and interaction than we're left with now. What we're left with now is kind of an all or nothing scenario, and neither side, I think, is willing to really give in.
Yeah. So final question before we wrap up. If you could give the Trump administration some policy advice about how to, I guess we would both want to de-escalate, what would you suggest to do?
That's a good question. I think more than anything, what I would counsel the Trump administration to do is to really think about what you want to achieve here, right? And find some discernible areas of interaction that you can sort of build upon, right? So Syria is a good example. I mean, I think Syria is the best place for the Trump administration to start, because it's something that the Trump administration actually cares about, and something that Iran deeply cares about. But mollifying the U.S. position on Syria, for example, at least at the moment, and saying, okay, we're not going to sort of talk about your position in Syria as being illegitimate. However, we feel strongly that you should not have any sort of military capabilities in Syria that could be used against Israel, for example. So missiles, in particular, right? If they could hone in on one issue and say, this is the issue that we care most about right now, let's find a way to work on this one issue. Redeploy your missiles to Iraq, right? Or these missile factories in Syria, are things that we're watching, and things that we care about, and things that we don't want to exist. If you could pinpoint that, at least you could have a coherent conversation with Iran, right? You could have something to push back on, or something to highlight. But if it's an all or nothing sort of scenario, I don't think you're going to get anything out of it, right? And certainly at this moment, in terms of escalation or de-escalation, I think the best thing to do is obviously not escalate, right? Because what are you going to get out of it? What are you actually going to achieve if you strike Iran over this incident. But I think you've also made clear to Iran, both sort of overtly in the public sphere, but also I assume through the Iraqis, through the Qataris, through the Omanis, perhaps through the Swiss and the Russians, that if they do anything against U.S. personnel, they really will respond to it. And so drawing, I think very clear red lines that you are actually willing and able to respond to is something that could be helpful in the sense that it tells Iran, this is really the limit for us. But I think in some ways, the Trump administration is trying to de-escalate. At least Trump himself, I think, is trying to de-escalate. And so I think there's some hope for those that don't really want to see this, turn into a war. There is some hope that cooler heads are prevailing.
Well, that's certainly the hope. And I think with that, that's a positive note to end the podcast. Avshana, it's great to talk to you about this. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Great to talk.
And thank you, everybody, for listening.